Okay, so one of the stories I want to tell about women in scriptures is let's go back to the creation period. There's some very valuable lessons we can learn from creation and the story of Eve that can help us out in understanding women's contributions to the scriptures. So when we look at the creation story in the King James version of the Bible, we see phrases like, and God created this, and God did this, and God did that. It's typically a singular term for deity, God, one person type of idea. And so we see this. Now, when it gets down to the time of creating humans, there's a bit of a challenge that we have to deal with. So I want to look at this in Genesis chapter 1. Let's talk about this. There's actually two versions of the creation story. Talk about this. I have a whole video on it on the channel as well. You can go look it up also. But here's a challenge. Here's what's interesting. Okay, so God's been going along this a singular name for God, and has been going along and has been doing these creations. And then verse 26 in Genesis chapter 1, and God said, let us, so now God singular, but let us, there's a plural there, make man in our image after our likeness, and let them, so here's what's interesting is God went from a singular reference, God, to us, meaning multiple gods. God's talking to someone in here after our likeness. So there's this plurality of God. Is he talking to himself? Singular, he's a singular person in the reference of the word God, but there's a us. There's a plurality to what he's saying. Let them, he says, let's make man out of our own image, and let them. So some people will look at man as singular. If you think of man as humankind, then them would be the plural, men and women, have dominion over the fish and the sea and the cattle and everything else, basically. Verse 27, so God created man. So this is God singular, man singular, possibly in his, so there's the singular, own image. So God's own image. In the image of God created he, him, male and female created he, them. So we're getting a singular God creating two different humans in there, basically. And then God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion, all these things. So in here, hopefully as you look at the text, you can see, wait a minute here, is God plural? Is God singular? What's happening? So if we think about the story of creation, it seems pretty 1 + 1 = 2 until we get to the creation of Adam and Eve. When Adam's created, it sounds pretty common. God creates man. Okay, that sounds 1-to-1. Makes man out of his own image. That sounds 1-to-1. If God created a man out of his image, then God must be a man. Therefore, there's this 1 + 1 = 2 type easy math to think this through. But then a woman is made out of the image of God as well. And now we go, wait a minute here. Hold on a second here. So just the creation of Eve has changed how we think about this whole creation story, because now we have to think about one God creating two different people. How does this work? This is something that scholars have dealt with for centuries, even millennia, really, to try to understand, well, how does this inform our understanding of God? If God created a man and a woman, so he created two different, there's very different anatomical reasons for man and woman to be separated out, male and female, but how can they come from the same being? Does that mean God has no body so he can kind of create anything he wants? Some people follow that logic. Some people look at it and say maybe God is a hermaphrodite. Maybe God is both genders, therefore he can create both from himself. So there's lots of these ideas that are out there on how do we use this to define who God is. Well, when you look at the Hebrew, now here's the beauty of incorporating women into this, okay? Our math went from 1 + 1 = 2 to a little bit more like algebra by introducing women. Women, by putting Eve in here, by adding female, has complicated the creation story quite a bit. Sometimes we will look at that as a bad thing. In reality, though, I think it's a good thing because it forces us to look at more nuance. Okay, From a man's standpoint, women seem very complicated in how they think. From a woman's standpoint, men probably just come across as very simple-minded because there's different ways that men and women think. So when we look at the creation story, women are complicating it. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. A lot of people want to take it that way, and I don't think it means that, because we are forced, thanks to the introduction of Eve into the creation story, the female, we have to rethink our understanding of who God is. And when you get back into the Hebrew languages, the ancient Hebrew, you see that the term that was commonly used in Genesis chapter 1 is Elohim. Now, Elohim is a singular name for God, but it is also commonly used in the scriptures for a plural name for God. So you could say, and I know Dan McClellan talks a lot about this. He has several videos. He goes into this on his YouTube channel. He says that in a way we could read the creation period story as saying the gods did this, the gods did that, or the council of the gods did this. So it was the council of gods that created everything, not just a singular God that created everything, according to the ancient Hebrew. Now, this is really important for us to look at, is because we wouldn't have thought, I mean, eventually we'd look at the ancient Hebrew and go, wait, there's a plurality of gods here. But see, Eve has helped us to think through this and have to look back and go, wait a minute, how do we understand God? So when we think of a council of gods, it is very possible for a female goddess to create females on earth. There is an opportunity there. So in the LDS perspective, LDS philosophy is really interesting around women in the scriptures, because the LDS philosophy believes in a heavenly mother, that there is a goddess that is equal with God, and they work together to help their children, us, out, basically. And so when we think of this, we could say, in a way, this council of gods, meaning our heavenly parents, were a part of that. So they were involved in this creation opportunity to create humans out of themselves. So we can see start to see more of an active role of a heavenly mother in the creation period when we think about this word Elohim. In fact, anytime you hear the word Elohim, think of it in a singular and a plural, and think about which one makes more sense. So for LDS people, the most common place you're going to hear the word Elohim comes in the temple. When you go to the temple and you go through the endowment ceremony and they use that term Elohim, I want you to replace it with heavenly parents and see what sticks out in your mind as you go through that, and just see how does that change your experience of looking at the temple, and what is it teaching you, and just see how that feels as you do that. I'd love to hear your comments after you've done that, what you think about that. So come back and leave those comments here too. So from a metaphorical standpoint, the creation of female has forced us to understand God better, which has allowed us to understand a more nuanced philosophy that there are male and female gods that work together in heaven, like on a council or a family type idea, to bless us and help us here. So we can say that there is more active involvement of a female deity during the creation period. So some fun things to think about and understand as we look at that. So Eve herself was really interesting in some of the things that she has done. We unfortunately do not have a lot about Eve in the Bible. There's just not a lot here of her speaking, her doing things, other than giving birth and doing more feminine things, basically. But what's interesting is when we look at this story, okay, we get into these ideas of Adam and Eve. They're in this garden. They're doing things together. They're told, don't eat the fruit of certain trees. And those are things that you need to do. So let's get into Genesis chapter 3 for a second here. This is where Satan comes in. And so we see in here Eve plays a role in this. So in Genesis chapter 3, the serpent got into the garden, and the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit. So Eve is telling the serpent, hey, we're not supposed to eat the fruit of those trees. That doesn't work for us, basically. We can't do that. And and what's interesting is we don't hear Adam's side of the story on this in this beginning part. So this is a conversation. Genesis chapter 3 is Eve and Satan in the Garden of Eden going through this. So verse 4, the serpent says unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So this is the conversation Eve is having. Again, we're not hearing Adam's conversation in the LDS temple. Their version of this, I think it follows a bit more with the Book of Moses as well. Their version is Satan goes to Adam first. Adam basically does the most male thing he can do, which is to ignore Satan's opinion and double down on his own opinion. Basically, men tend to do that, just ignore everybody else's opinion and double down on their own opinion, without really fully understanding the context and what's going on. But and then Satan has to go to Eve. Now, in the temple, there's a little bit more to this story, which is, I think, really interesting, because when Satan goes to Eve during the instruction part of the endowment ceremony, the first question Eve asks is, Who are you? She starts to establish relationship with Satan. So she's trying to qualify and understand, how does this guy, I'm in this garden, I know me, I know God, that we see God and things. He sometimes visits us and talks with us. I know Adam, but where the heck did you come from? You don't fit in. How do you fit in with everything else that's going on? So in a way, you could say she's going, wait a minute, here's another man. Why are you in this story? How do you fit? She's establishing that relationship and that context. And he says, I'm your brother. And she's like, wait a minute, you're my brother. So you're putting us on an equal playing field, but why are you here to cause me to disobey Father then? Because he's the one that has the law, and he lays down the law. And so she starts to really understand more of the context around the situation. And what's interesting is in Genesis, well, we don't get that part of it here in Genesis. In Genesis, it says that after Satan gave his version of here's why you should take this fruit, verse 6, then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them were opened, they knew that they were naked, they sewed fig leaves together and made aprons. So this is Genesis chapter 3 is a simplified version of this story, but it's the woman, we are told, who eats first. Eve historically has gotten a lot of bad rap from this. Everybody's blamed Eve for all the world's problems. Well, if she hadn't eaten the fruit, we wouldn't have all had these problems. You also have to realize, if she hadn't eaten the fruit, none of us would be alive either. They would just stay in existence in Adam and Eve would have stayed in the Garden of Eden and never left. And so, which means they weren't mortal, which means they couldn't have children, and so on and so forth. So the thing is that Eve is the one that understood the nuance, the complicatedness of the problem that God has put them into their position. You see, if you look at the story, okay, if you look at the story, they're told, and Eve is explaining this to Satan, they're told there's the tree, that we cannot eat the fruit thereof, or we will die. Now, in the story that is in the LDS temple, and I think again in the Book of Moses a little bit more, there's two trees in that story. There's a contrast. You can eat the fruit of these trees. One allows you to live forever. The other one allows you to be mortal. And God says, don't eat the one that makes you mortal. But here's the problem, is now I need you to multiply and replenish the earth, which means you need to be mortal, but I also don't want you to eat the tree that allows you to be mortal. So that's the contradiction around the one tree, basically, is there's these two issues. I want you to be mortal and multiply and replenish the earth, but I don't want you to eat the tree that makes you mortal. So do you see how, in a way, God has forced Adam and Eve to make a choice? That's the thing, is they've been forced to make this choice. And what Eve realizes is, in order for us to keep both commandments, we have to eat the fruit. We can, in order to follow God, but also be mortal and replenish and multiply and do those things, we got to be mortal. So it was more important to eat the fruit than to not eat the fruit. Eve is the one that figured it out. She understood the nuance and complexity better than Adam did. Therefore, we should praise Eve for starting the ball rolling in the rest of the plan of salvation. As long as Adam and Eve remained in the Garden of Eden, they were in a somewhat of a celestialized type state, from what we understand. They weren't fully mortal, and so they could never die. They couldn't, we don't know how long they actually lived there. They could have been there for millions of years and we wouldn't even have known it. We don't have a frame of reference of how long they were in the garden. We just know that at some point they ate the fruit finally, and it was after Eve understood the complication. She didn't fall to temptation. She understood that God is forcing them to make a choice. And either way they make the choice, they're going to break a law. So which one, when you have two laws that conflict, then you have to start to ask yourself, well, which one's the more important one to keep? And that's what Eve did. And she said, oh, we need to move forward on this plan. We need to get mortal and do all this. This is important that we do this. It's, in the temple endowment video, the instruction part, it actually has Eve say, it is better for us that we know the sorrow and the pain, that we know the good from the evil and things. So she understood the nuance. She started the ball rolling for the rest of the plan of salvation. We owe her a debt of gratitude, I believe, because of that. So there is a complexity and a nuance to how women think that allow them to see things different than us, than the men. So that's important for us to always pay attention to. Let's use that as we understand how can we make our church better? How can we make this life better? Let's value a woman's perspective, because there is a lot of value in it, and understanding. Just because it's a different point of view doesn't mean it's a wrong point of view. Let's be more accepting and willing to work with these different points of view. Diversity is not a bad thing. Diversity is there to force us to learn to help each other and work together. Diversity is not there to divide us. Satan wants us to believe that diversity divides us. God wants diversity to give us an excuse to find ways to come together. And I think that's a big part of this as well. So that's a little bit about Adam and mainly Eve, basically, in her story of what she has done to contribute dramatically to the value of what we have, and how she helps us. So she herself literally helps us move forward in progression from the pre-existence to the mortal, so that we can progress to the next phase of everything in heaven. But even metaphorically, she has told us so much, and has helped us understand that the complexity and the nuance of women's thinking can help us think better about the scriptures, and even see different points of view that might help us to progress in our understanding of the gospel. So one thing to always remember is, in the ancient world, typically the word for wisdom is a feminine term. In Greek, it was Sophia. So wisdom is usually seen as a feminine trait. Let's make sure we're using wisdom in our decision making and how things go. Now, I'm not advocating that women need to have equality in everything. Maybe I'll do a video on that, because I think I was going to do some videos on women in the priesthood, and I'll talk about power and equality and why we have to be careful how we think about those things, because how the world thinks about those things is not the way that the gospel is looking at them as well. So we'll get into those videos later, but hopefully you've enjoyed this. I'd love to read your comments about how have understanding Eve in these ways has maybe changed your perspective or ideas in the scriptures. And we'll see you in the next video.